when somebody put Iceland on eBay for sale, not for so much money, and when all the headlines were about Russians are going to save Iceland, and all the photos were about people demonstrating in front of banks and so on and so on. So, and now we have not opportunity to see the name of Iceland in headlines at all, though there will be parliamentary elections in April. Right now, what happened? Where did you disappear? Why? Cyprus is in headlines, Greece is in headlines, Iceland disappeared. Why?
You will hear from us again.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, ministers, ambassadors, distinguished scholars, students, dear friends, I'm very happy to be with you once again. The problem will be to stick within the timetable, 50 minutes, I'm told, and to cover the subject. Let me begin by asking a simple question. What are the outstanding similarities or differences between three islands, Iceland, Ireland, Cyprus, that have become victims of financial crisis within the time span of 5 years? Some things are strikingly similar. One, all of those countries pursued one variety or another of neoliberal policies. What do I mean by that? I mean that state interference in the economy was discouraged. There was strong belief in market solutions, even in the power of markets to correct themselves, meaning justification for abolishing or relaxing laws, regulations, supervision of financial markets. This is the essence. Look at Iceland. The center-right government of Iceland from approximately 1999 to the crash, 2008, pursued such policies. They began by privatizing the fish stocks, then the banking system, and they had it as a declared policy to make Iceland into a financial center, in other words, tax haven. Ireland pursued lowering taxes, especially corporate taxes and taxes on financial income, to attract foreign capital very successfully, but at the same time, the Irish banks borrowed heavily abroad and financed a gigantic housing bubble that exploded in their face. Cyprus is a well-known and well-established tax haven. The difference is that they, through secrecy, high interest rates, attracted financial flows, 1/3 of it from Russian oligarchs, with deposits in their system rather than simply borrowing. Now, if we compare this to the Scandinavians across the Baltic Sea, they weathered this financial storm better than most. Why? Is it because they had already gone through the neoliberal period? Because all of them went through a severe financial crisis in the beginning of the 90s. Sweden, Norway, Finland, certainly. But this time, they were pretty stable. Another thing that is strikingly similar is the extreme growth, some would say cancerous growth, of the financial sector in those three countries I'm talking about. In Iceland, after privatization of banks, which ended in 2002, the financial system outgrew the real sector by a factor of 10 times GDP in 6 years. That's a world record. All of it borrowed, all of it on borrowed money. And when it all went down, as the Ponzi scheme that it was, it turned out that this very small country had made it into the list of the 10 greatest financial bankruptcies in history. That's quite an achievement. Ireland, as I said, was basically, or what was crucial for them, what sealed their fate, was the building bubble, the real estate bubble. The Irish, in a few years' time, built more houses than the United Kingdom, which is a much, much more numerous society. And the basic questions for us is to perhaps compare. Did it make any difference to be outside the EU, as Iceland was, or to be on the inside, as Ireland and Cyprus were? I am describing the overgrowth, outside growth of financial services, outgrowing the GDP, in the case of Iceland, by a factor of 10, in Cyprus perhaps by a factor of 7. This is a recipe for a bubble economy, meaning there is footloose capital, fickle, coming in, trying to make short-term gain, but very quick out when things go down. So, boom and bust prescription. But there are differences as well. When we ask, how did those societies, small societies, react when they faced reality? Well, the difference is between bailing out the bank system, as in the case of Ireland, and the bank simply declaring the bank system bankrupt, as in the case of Iceland. And now, recently in Cyprus, there was a middle way, because there was reorganization of banks. One of them was written off. The assets moved into the major one, which is meant to be kept afloat. But the difference is between bailout or bankruptcy. In the case of Iceland, the government certainly tried in the beginning to bail the banks out. They nationalized the first bank that went down, and they emptied the foreign currency reserves of the central bank, trying to save the rest. But Gordon Brown, blessed be his memory, did us a great favor. When the British authorities thought that the Icelandic banks had actually become insolvent, the British moved to have them all registered as terrorist organizations, along with Al-Qaeda. Not only the Icelandic banks operating in London, but the Icelandic government and the central bank to boot. And when you have gotten that sort of a treatment, it's no use opening your door as a bank, you can close them. Looking by hindsight now, that is the best thing that happened to Iceland. The banks became bankrupt. There was not a chance in hell for the Icelandic government to bail them out. 10 times, indebted 10 times GDP. So, the question is, who lost most of the bankruptcy of the Icelandic financial system? Answer, German banks. German bankers lost, because of their wrong investment decisions, the equivalent of 7 Icelandic GDPs. The rest we had to pay. But this means, when I say German banks, I should add, they were not exclusively German, they were Austrians, they were British, they were Scandinavian, etc. But basically, 2/3 at least were German loans, bad loans. And when I say this was, by hindsight, the best thing that happened to us, what I mean, and is crucial, is this. If we had tried, and if we had received help, be it from the IMF or the EU, to bail out the banks, the debt burden would have crushed us for the rest of our lives. Look at Ireland. The Irish government made a wrong decision in panic, trying to save off, run on the banks. They declared, gave a guarantee. They declared a guarantee that the state guaranteed the Irish banks' debts. They didn't have a clue at the time toxic loans were hidden in their vaults. And it turned out that the sums were much, much higher than they had thought. And the result is that when it came to the crunch, the creditors could present the bill to the government, meaning that Irish taxpayers have been obliged to pay for the mistaken policies and investment decisions of their bankers, which is utterly wrong. In the Spectator today they have a new phrase. Usually when we ask, why should taxpayers bail out banks? The answer is they're too big to fail. The Spectator today is saying they were actually too big to jail. And that's the point.
To fit to jail.
Too big.
To fit to jail.
Too big to jail. Yeah, to fit into the jail.
And notice please that this is social democrat talking.
Yes, there's no hiding of that. But what's the conclusion then from those three examples? Did it make a major difference to be in or outside the Eurozone? Of course there was a difference. Iceland was on its own. It couldn't go anywhere to seek financial support. Even our neighbors and friends in the Nordic countries said, you have behaved so recklessly and irresponsibly, we would not trust you with money, go to the IMF. So Iceland became the second country after the war to go into receivership by the IMF. The first case was actually Britain in 1976. But the other countries, Ireland, is now suffering from, it's now probably, I think it is correct, that it's the second most indebted country in the world after Japan. And the burden for Irish taxpayers will be heavy. We have not now yet the whole picture of the calamity for Cyprus, except prognosis for that their economy will contract considerably. There will no longer be any tax haven, and the financial sector had employed 150,000 out of 700,000 people on the island, so that's no small change. What is the conclusion then? If we look, if we ask the question, what is the difference between being in or out? Look at Finland. Finland is in. It's in the Eurozone. It's doing quite well. It weathered the storm. Sweden is out. How are the Swedes doing? Pretty well. Even better than the Finns. And they're out. There's no difference between being in or out. The question is, how good and sound was the domestic economic management in those countries? It was pretty sound. Also because they had already, more than 10 years ago, gone through a similar financial storm with devastating effect. Look at the comparison between Iceland and Ireland. Both have been heavily hit. And the social consequences for the people in those countries are grave. In Ireland, the unemployment is very heavy and immigration. In Iceland, it is the polarization of society that is the worst. Because, I'll tell you a little bit more about it when I describe the special effects of devaluation. But if we are trying to measure the consequences in each case, we have to take that into account. Because that's one difference. Of course, those who are in the Eurozone, they can devalue. And that is a strength, after all. Iceland we had our national currency, and in the advent to the crash, the owners of the banks, in their desperation to shore up foreign currency to save their banks, they took a position against the krona, with the result that we had not a devaluation, we had a collapse of the domestic currency to the tune of 70 to 90% in a few weeks' time. What does this mean in an indebted country where many families are indebted, mortgages in foreign currency, companies mostly with foreign currency loan? It meant that Iceland turned from being almost not indebted in terms of the state, became suddenly heavily indebted, now approximately 90% of GDP. Companies, heavily indebted, 60% of them were technically bankrupt. Homes, 1/4 roughly, with foreign denominated loans, saw the loans, the capital stock of the loans double. After devaluation, you have inflation, so interest rates skyrocketed. And then again, after the bubble ended, the prices of apartments fell, so you were basically dispossessing a whole generation. It is more or less pointless to ask who is worse off, the dispossessed young Icelander emigrated to Norway, or the unemployed Irishman who emigrated to Canada. Krugman is very often mentioned when we are talking about those issues. He happens to believe that devaluations are the most quick and efficient way of reducing the standard of life, but he never mentions the hardship, the social suffering that people that the victims of devaluations have. And one other thing about devaluations, because some people who believe it to be a quick fix for everything, they should reconsider, because devaluation means inflation. Inflation means higher prices and increased costs, and you begin almost immediately to collect into the next devaluation. It is something, it's inviting a bubble economy with high fluctuations, lack of stability, and periodic collapses. It is not a way that I recommend. It is not what you should learn from the Icelandic experience, that devaluation of a Krugman is a panic. Not so. Is time?
You have 2-3 minutes.
2-3 minutes, okay. Another question then, to close with. Why is it that the hopes, the high hopes for the European Monetary Union, for the Eurozone, for the Euro, have disappointed so many in so many countries? Is it basically true, which many economists are telling us, that from the beginning there was a fatal flaw in design in the European Union? What am I talking about? Well, economics textbooks tell us, among other things, this. For an optimal currency union, you have to fulfill 3 basic conditions absolutely. Number 1, you must have a central bank, which is the lender of last resort for the whole of the currency union, meaning also the member states. Second, you must control the money supply, which means that the central bank must have the power to issue or buy bonds issued by the member states, because there are ups and downs in the economy, and the central bank must have the resources and the power to help those who are in trouble. And the third thing, you must have a minimum of coordination between fiscal and monetary policy if you are going to keep the system stable. We know that the European Central Bank doesn't have any of those powers. Why not? Well, I was a foreign minister dealing with the war in his time. I consider him still to be the greatest of commissioners. I knew very well from that time that people were aware of those flaws in design. But why did we accept it? Simple. Germany said, no, under no circumstances, with their hangover from the Weimar Republic inflation, would they accept a central bank with those powers. And France had to say, okay, but at any rate we will, you give up the Deutschmark and you take up the euro, and then we hope for the best, hoping for that the weak and the strong would somehow converge with time. This is the key flaw. Compare it to a real monetary union, which is called the United States of America. California is a fiscally bankrupt state. They brought it upon themselves because they voted in a referendum for a change in the constitution which bans tax rises. It didn't ban increased expenditures. So they have expanded the expenditures but no more taxes, which means that California is fiscally bankrupt and politically in a gridlock. Why wasn't California thrown out of the Union, just like Greece? Why is it that the markets, the lenders, the bond markets, do not drive up the borrowing costs of California just as they do for the weaker countries in Europe? Why? It is because they know that in the United States, in the monetary union, which is the United States, there is a federal government and there is a Federal Reserve System that backs California to the hilt. If California is being ambushed by market forces, they are up against the power of the Federal Reserve. Not so here, not so in Europe. This is a fundamental flaw in the design of a monetary union, and it must be corrected if we are not going to repeat stories of Iceland, of Ireland, of Greece, of Cyprus, of Portugal, of Spain. That is the basic lesson.
I bet there were many people in this country who would like to see me arrested in 2010, maybe more than today. And of course, this tells how complicated the situation was. Well, Lithuania's problems were somewhat distant from Icelandic, Cyprus in particular, and Ireland to some extent. This construction file was similar, but at least there was no issue of the big banking sector in this country. But one great similarity between Lithuania and Iceland is there, or Baltic states and Iceland. All those countries were kind of at the forefront of the crisis, because first it was Iceland 5 years ago, but very quickly the eyes of the market turned to Baltic states, seeing the fundamental developments, high inflation, high current account deficit, and all the story, and definitely saying that, oh, there should be some devaluation in those countries. And as Lithuanians are saying, neither a devil nor a cuckoo. I mean, we kind of technically could have used that option, and definitely major part of the market, investors and well, many there were expecting us to do so, because this is something that all governments, or nearly all governments in trouble, finally did.
Were literally urged to do
maybe somebody put some money into this and wanted to earn a bit. So definitely that it's not even a matter of urging, but purely if you look back at the history, you see that there are Hong Kong and the Baltic states are the only cases where you see internal adjustment of that size done via internal wage and price adjustment with no devaluation. Definitely, I mean, I cannot blame the markets that they were not believing that this can be done at all. And I was meeting investors in the autumn 2009, trying to sell them Lithuanian bonds, and they were saying, look guys, what you are trying to do is not doable. And they were pretty frank, because they knew it from past experience. So definitely, the situation was complicated, situation was urgent, situation was extraordinary, because we had a change of government, at the same juncture, which was even more complicated for kind of sell the problem to the public, because well, in kind of a simplistic thinking, you can think that it's just the change of government that caused the problems, not the fundamental issues. But coming back to this corporatist culture and decision making, definitely I would agree to a large extent. I'm not so familiar with how this culture developed so strongly in Scandinavian countries, whether it was so strong before 1990 crisis or after 1990 crisis as a kind of a consequence about how you deal with that. Because yes, all Nordic countries had experienced quite similar experience to Baltic states in the beginning of 1990s. And it would have been easier if there were kind of somebody to call to and talk to and say, look guys, we have a problem here and we need to sort that out together. But maybe in the case of Baltic states, I'm not sure whether it would be realistic to expect that in the 20th year of the restored independence, you can have such a strong dialogue and such strong institutions in both within government and outside the government to debate those issues realistically. Yes, I know that in some new member states, it is quite striking to me that this is present, because my old friend who is working in IMF, she worked for Bulgaria. And in Bulgaria, trade unions knew that if you have a currency board, then your wage increases must be regulated by your productivity increases. So it was much easier to talk to the trade unions who know how you deal with the kind of basic economic policies that are in place. I don't know how many Lithuanian trade unionists really know what currency board is about. So definitely that is to some extent more complicated. So, but I agree that this is a way to kind of deal with the situation easier, and we must pay tribute to my Prime Minister Andris Kubilius, who even tried to set up this framework in Lithuania in 2009. Trying to call major business institutions and major trade unions kind of around the table and get a sort of agreement that we should well, somehow agree to a package of decisions that were deemed to be necessary. And there was debate, and there was quite an extensive, not always successful discussion about what should be done and how and when. But if this debate has started earlier, I mean before crisis, if this marriage would not only be for bad but also for good, because when the times seem to be good, there are also some problems underlying that need to be visible to all the partners. So if and there is no surprise that kind of new European member states have one very clear goal before them. They want to catch up as quickly as it is possible. So if you see that more or less situation is good, we are catching up, so maybe there is nothing wrong in that. So
let's don't deceive ourselves. You can't explain to Lithuanian that this your heap of hay is going to burn until he sees smoke.
Well, yes, there is this belief. Though maybe if you talk to people long enough, at some juncture they start to believe you. I mean, I cannot say, because my job was mainly dealing with something that was already burning. And of course, some things could have been done before in order not to have such a big fire. But well, there was no political will basically to engage into that. So maybe for the next crisis, which will definitely come.
Well.
have you placed your bet somewhere? Maybe for the next crisis, this importance of kind of consensus decision making would be more visible. But at this recent event, unfortunately, I must say that I wish we could have talked to opposition. I wish we could have talked to some major players, but it looked like everybody was just for his or her own interest in that, and that's how, at the end of the day, most probably we lost more than we could have lost if there were more consensus on what we did. So maybe that's it.
Thank you so much, and please, Jon Baldvin, come back to at least here around. And we are slowly and smoothly driving into this part, which is called discussion, actually. So one of the microphones should be handed over to the auditorium. This one, yeah. And this will be mine, and I will distribute this.
Shall we pay?
Oh, that's a good question from Finance Minister. And let's return to some really important issues which Jon Baldvin has raised at the very beginning. Inside EMU or outside EMU? And remember, we have Latvia around the corner, which has done perfectly, but it is still considered to be safe haven for Russian money. And still the pipelines of Russian money are somewhere around here. Just like with the case of Cyprus. So you are talking about moving to federalism, more federalism, and taking as example the United States of America, and I'm a great fan of the United States of Europe, of course, in the very closest future. But don't you think that Europe is moving toward this, to this federalization, to this closer cooperation?
Perhaps the course of events is directing Europe in that direction, but there are very resistant forces. After all, there is a strong body of opinion saying we do not want more integration, we want Europe of the nations, or the predominant British view of we want to participate in the inner market in a sort of free trade area arrangement like the EFTA-EEA, but we don't want anything else. So this is a conflictual situation. What is bad about it is that we are caught in this conflict. For technical reasons, we need further integration if we are to make our monetary union functioning. It is not good enough. If it would not be considered good enough in the US, if the federal government, or especially the Federal Reserve, would say to California, you're on your own. Why should we, taxpayers in New England, in Boston and New York, pay for the debts of the sunbathers on the sunny shores of California? German headlines to Greece.
They are saying that. Exactly.
But the system is there. There is there's not a flicker of doubt about it that California is not going anywhere. California will not be thrown out. There is no California exit. California exit.
Join Mexico.
Yeah, this is all the way around. We have countries that have badly mismanaged their economies within the European Union. I lived part of the year in Spain. I am fully aware that the Spaniards had done major mistakes in their economic management. They reacted to the oncoming and foreseeable bubble economy far too late. And the enumeration of the mistakes or the faults in economic management in Greece. I mean, it's sufficient for a PhD thesis. What is the advantage of being in a monetary union? It is this. We have a common currency, and it's not going to be devalued. That is a sort of given guarantee for long-term stability in the price level, in the level of wages, for companies to plan ahead, for technological innovation. Stability is the key thing. But if a country is in trouble, a monetary union means that it's not on its own. If it is on its own, there's no point in having this monetary union. So, if I'm right in saying that there is a fatal flaw in the design, and the law admitted it, the designer himself in the early 90s, if I'm right, then we are right that there is this design, isn't it political realism that the Germans and the French and those who think they are the leaders of Europe should sit down and correct the fault? It's not good enough to go on as we have been going on. So I think this is somebody said, you said, Madam, I hope we will be better prepared for the next crisis. And you said, well, the next crisis is upon us if we don't change course. We have to get much more powerful tools to deal with financial crisis within an optimal currency union than we still have. We don't have a functioning central bank. We don't have a coordinated fiscal monetary policy. We don't have even the ability for the central authority to come to the aid of a country in trouble. We don't have a banking union with common rules and responsibilities for issuing bank licenses, for surveillance of banks, and for the maintenance and power of the minimum deposit insurance system. This is a halfway house, and the storms the gales are all over, and the house doesn't keep weather and wind.
The house was suited for southern climates, like Italy or Spain, actually not for northern climate. Do you have any questions from the public? No. You were promoted as a very inquisitive, very active, and so on.
The students are very talkative today.
We have one student.
Yeah, we have one. And what would be the answer of Lithuanian conservatives to Icelandic socialism? About the bankrupting banks, actually.
No, my comment or my question to Mr. Hannibalsson on neoliberalism and something like domestic nationalism. What's better? If you look into the recent crisis, so in Iceland the crisis was started because of national banks, which became too big to fail, or too big to jail, or things like that. In our case, the crisis came from outside, from the global development, from the globalization, from Lithuania becoming, as Baltic states, becoming members of the EU, Scandinavian banks coming to the Baltic states, giving very easy credits, economies started to boom, we got the construction boom and heated economies, and then instead of cooling down, Lehman Brothers crisis, again global crisis. And we went down by, as it was shown, by minus 15%, all three Baltic states in 2009. But we lost less than Iceland. So my question is, what is better? To be dependent on global developments and sometimes making not proper decisions some of that. Luckily, it disappeared. And depending on let's say, banking sector from Scandinavia or from other countries, and being dependent on, let's say, global neoliberal developments, or being, let's say, more domestically orientated, developing some kind of banking sector, and then collapsing as it happened in some islands.
There is contradictions, in your question, because actually we are depending on Scandinavian banks, and they are, as we have seen, corporativists, all of them around, all of them.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for the question. I'll try to deal with it as best as I can. You are, of course, absolutely right that in both cases, in your case and in our case, the problem was to deal with an international financial crisis. In the case of Iceland, the government is criticized for not having done what it could do to not eliminate the crisis, but to implement damage control. I mean, there were experts who actually wrote reports at least half a year before the actual crisis, spelling it out, that the basic business concept of the Icelandic banks was utterly unsustainable. That there was no way that the Icelandic central bank would have reserves to back it up in a crisis. And it was spelled out what they should have done. They should, for instance, have changed the foreign branches into subsidiaries and thus made the subsidiaries into the responsibility of the financial authorities in, say, Britain, Holland, Germany. They didn't do it. They should have moved the headquarters of some of those banks, which were actually operating abroad. Only 5 or 10% of their activity was in Iceland. They should have moved to the city of London where they were actually operating. They didn't do it. If the government would have done at least what this minimum, it would have averted a lot, and it would have minimized the utter collapse of the currency. I can well imagine that on the Baltic side you could say, not only you, but also perhaps Estonia and Latvia, look, yes, we have pursued neoliberal policies, minimum state sector, state intervention, we trust in the markets, we rely heavily on the influx of foreign capital, we try to attract foreign capital, and we were successful. And when it comes to the crisis, well, you were lucky that the bloody banks were foreign, weren't we? That was a blessing, just as it was a blessing for us to have been put on the Al-Qaeda list. It was a blessing in disguise. And you were quick in recovery, because if I were asked, has Iceland recovered? My answer is no. We are still in the process. How come? We devalued, yes, and we have piled up debt, yes, and we, to keep our currency afloat, the IMF for the first time in its history implemented capital control. They absolutely rejected it before for any other countries. They realized that it was impossible to repeat this adventure with the Icelandic currency. Why? Because during the crazy boom times, the Icelandic currency had become one of the strongest currencies in the world. The rate of interest was sky high, and it had attracted fickle, speculative capital into Iceland. When the banks went bankrupt, and when we imposed the capital controls, this capital, foreign capital, speculative, was locked in our currency area. They are now wanting to get out. But if we would abolish the capital controls tomorrow, and all this capital would rush out, we would have a new devaluation. And that devaluation means a new inflation rate first, a new increase in the capital stock of debts. It would ruin Iceland. So we are not out of the woods. And in that sense, you might say, well, we took a heavy hit, we went to the bottom, we are now up again, and perhaps you have better hope of recovery on that basis than we have. And I would like to ask you another question instead. My friend Baldur has been talking about social partnership and the Nordic model, cooperate, everybody is very good to each other and we try to negotiate and they've been doing it for more than half a century, so it takes time. It takes time, like in marriages. We used the weapon of currency devaluation. That means that with one stroke, purchasing power of people are cut, in our case 20–25%. Boom. Then we increase taxes, then we increase prices, then we increase payments for social services, and I mean the standard of life, meaning the competitive position, is improved. You do it through something what's called internal devaluation. When I was studying economics, this concept didn't exist. I had hardly heard about this, that you could implement internal devaluation. How do you do it? Fiat? Or do you do it by asking people in the public sector, will you please be kind enough to reduce your salaries by 15%? And please do it now. And if it's not enough, do you come to them again and say, this was not enough, sorry, please 10% more. If you can do this, this would be impossible to do with strong trade union tradition like as in Sweden and Norway. They would say, no, go to hell. What did it say to you?
Go to hell. Inga will add, but really, it's, I would say that answering to your question and making some comments on this topic of corporatist small state, of course, I fully agree with what Inga said, that in a young democracy, such kind of corporatist social consensus tradition is still very weak. Of course, labor unions also are quite weak. So that makes situation maybe in a way easier when you are forced to make internal evaluations through political legal decisions. Political legal decisions. I mean decisions which are made in the parliament with initiative from the government. Of course, government comes with showing an example, with some kind of show, first of all, cutting salaries to very happy ministers and prime minister itself, But
and Bristol writing that you are paying bonuses.
Yeah. What we saw, of course, maybe because of still in a young democracy, people as Lithuania, which went through, and the Baltic states, went through several crises, people are still not very much accustomed to some kind of stable luxury life. So for them, something like, again, crisis, again, hits, in the salaries, or unemployment rising up, is not something very much unexpected. So it was easier, perhaps, to keep stability in the society despite the broken windows in the parliament at the very beginning, but it was easier if to compare with some other countries. Of course, we started all the negotiations with the social partners, with the business associations and labor unions. Luckily, industrial association was very positive at the end of 2009, to have such kind of agreements, and labor unions follow, simply maybe not understanding very well what we are going to agree, but when the industries were saying that if we shall fail, then will be a very big problem, even labor unions agree. What was the biggest problem, of course, and that is where I cannot maybe use this model of corporatist state in our case. Of course, very difficult was to try to agree in the parliament with the opposition, to find a way how to convince them. It was a very difficult possibility. And what is developing in the Baltic states? I don't know if you see something similar in Estonia, but I would say that what is an outcome of the crisis after 4 years of the crisis, after all the elections and changes in the government, is I see that some kind of consensus with reality is coming into political mentality. We are in a very limited area of choices, of economical and financial decisions.
Member of Parliament, it's not elections.
Yeah, I am finishing. Yeah, I am finishing. Sorry. You know, with 70% of our budget expenditures directed to social needs, education, healthcare, social security, for each government, despite what they were speaking before elections, it's very reality check is very strong, and that is what makes
Let me summarize.
consensus.
You are generally saying that instead of corporatist democracy, we've had social and mental flexibility.